Welcome to this brief overview of nature laws that work in a Q&A session. So my name is Chris McGrath, I'm a barrister in Brisbane. So I would like to begin by recognising and respecting the traditional owners of this land, elders past, present and emerging, and future generations on which we hold this land in trust. In outline, I'm going to do three broad things. We're going to finish with a Q&A session, but I'm going to start with what is the problem. And the problem, as we know, is an ongoing massive loss of habitat for biodiversity. And I want to just unpack that a little bit because we know the broad brush statement, but I want to look at a case study of how the current environmental laws, the national environmental laws, are really giving illusory protection to a lot of biodiversity. And I'm going to focus on the lack of protection for black-throated finch habitat for the Adani coal mine, just as a brief case study. Then we'll talk about what is the solution, and I'm really going to emphasize there is no simple, single solution that we can just set and forget. We're always going to need to work on this. It's not something we can just fix and walk away. Having said that, I'm going to go on to talk briefly and unpack the issue of, well, who regulates the environment? Because I perceive that that's probably a key concern that you have in talking about the need for national environmental laws, because there's a lot of confusion, even amongst politicians and regulators, about who regulates what in relation to the environment. So I just want to unpack that briefly, and I've given you a little diagram on the handout, which I hope is a useful little summary for you. Then I'm going to finish by focusing on what TWIS is campaigning for, the need for new national laws and a new national regulator. And then we've got some questions that have been sent in, and we're also happy to take any more that come from the floor, and also happy if we don't get to you or you think of something later on, send me an email or bring it through Gemma and we can circulate any answers to any further questions. So in outline, that's what we're going to cover. So let's start with what is the problem. And as we know, we've got ongoing massive loss of habitat for biodiversity. We really focus on habitat loss for biodiversity in this campaign rather than obviously climate change, a whole range of other issues, massive illegal fishing internationally. There's a whole range of issues that we've got, but for this campaign it's really focusing on, well, we're just losing massive amounts of habitat, particularly, for instance, for koalas, and national laws are clearly failing in this regard, so what can be done about it? I want to just unpack the problem a bit with a case study of the lack of protection of black-throated finch habitat for the Adani coal mine. So this is what looks like a big black-throated finch, but can you see the little finger down the bottom of the screen? So it looks like a giant bird. It's actually very small, about the size of your hand. So the Adani coal mine, sure most people know, is proposed to be located in central Queensland. An enormous amount of news about it over many years, been a huge focus of campaigns by many conservation groups in Australia. Huge issue and ongoing. Just looking at the mine, the layout for the mine, it's enormous. So this layout shows a map of the mine. The green stippled area that you see are what are proposed to be open cut coal pits, and then the coal dips from east to west. So they've got open cut coal pits on the eastern side. What looks like in the middle, the yellow is basically they take the overburden off and they store it to the east, but they're basically digging down in that green area, and then when the coal gets too deep, they go underground. So what look like louvers on the left of the green stippled area are the underground mines. So the open cut pits, as you know, they dig down, take the overburden off, and they dig down to the coal seams. It goes down a long way. So a massive amount of dirt to be moved. And of course you lose all of the habitat that's at the top. Now, one thing that I find hardest to conceptualize is just how enormous these mines are. Just the scale of them is really difficult to comprehend. So I hope this visual will help you. This is the layout, as I said before, it's 25 kilometres across by 32 kilometres north to south. And just to give you some idea of what that means, if we looked at Brisbane, if you lay the Carmichael mine across Brisbane, it would stretch from Logan Home through to Chermside. So, 1 million people live in that area. So this enormous mine stretches right across the city. If we did the same thing in Sydney, I tried to focus in on the CBD because everyone knows that, but the mine just doesn't fit if you go in and focus on the CBD. So I put a little red circle around the CBD, like everyone's been to Circular Quay and the Opera House and how beautiful it is and the harbour. So that's in that little red circle. That's what most people, including people who that don't live in Sydney, are most familiar with. But to fit the mine in, you've actually got to zoom back out, and if you lay the mine across Sydney, it would stretch basically from Botany Bay. So if everyone's flown into Sydney, you've got Botany Bay where the airport is there, south of the red circle. And then the mine would stretch basically from Botany Bay or Sutherland all the way through to Kings Park in the northwestern suburbs. So it's really difficult to comprehend how big it is. 1 million people live in that area that the mine is going to disturb. And similarly, if we went down to Melbourne, so Melbourne you can see there right in the middle of that screen. So if you stretched the Carmichael mine across Melbourne, it would go all the way from sort of Clayton south up to the Greenvale Reservoir up in the north of Melbourne. So, again, 1 million people live in that space. And I also brought in Adelaide. So Adelaide, it'd stretch from Aberfoyle Park in the south all the way up to New Haven. So you get the idea that this is an enormous mine, an enormous disturbance to habitat. So I spent a lot of time litigating against the Carmichael mine, and from those cases I think there's 4 big fundamental failures in the assessment process. One is climate change. That's the glaring one that gets the focus and the impacts on the Great Barrier Reef, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to focus on the second one, which is the impacts on habitat of threatened species, the black-throated finch. There's also huge issues with its groundwater modelling and also economics. I'm going to leave all of those to one side. A couple of years ago I gave a seminar in Brisbane at the Global Change Institute. You can go onto my website if you're interested in it. It goes for about 40 minutes. And it unpacks all of those issues. And I think there are so many problems with this mine. But what I really want to focus on is the black-throated finch, because it's how this case study becomes most relevant to the quiz campaign. So here's a black-throated finch on the ground where the Carmichael mine is proposed. So it's listed as endangered under the national environmental laws, as also endangered under state laws, due to severe reduction in numbers and severe decline in range. And you can see, beautiful little bird resting there on someone's hand. So there's a great team of scientists who are part of the BTF recovery team who, understandably, absolutely love BTF. So here's another picture by Kim. So as I said before, it's not a massive bird, it's actually really small. And here's a picture. If you can see it, there's trees here, but in those trees there's a massive flock of black-throated finch. It's actually the largest flock ever recorded by essentially non-Indigenous, non-traditional owners. I'm sure the Aboriginal peoples that lived in that country saw massive flocks of them, but since they've been basically wiped out, there's only 2 remaining big populations of them. One just west of Townsville and one on the mine site. So this is a picture taken on the mine site of where basically habitat that's proposed to be cleared, and it was a flock of over 400 black-throated finch, so massive. So just to relate where the BTF are to the mine site, the BTF population on the mining lease and surrounds are really important. It's the most significant and largest population in the world. The area surrounding 10 Mile Bore, which is in the north of the mine, is critical for the species' survival. And this map was in essentially the environmental assessment documents that were prepared for the mine. And what it shows are the locations mapped as pie charts scaled to the total abundance over time. So the larger circles represent the higher abundance, and they're split for each year where the surveys occurred. So they occurred over 3 years. So the yellow, like if you look at the top with that yellow and red one, the big circle that's got 272 in the middle of it, that means that they found a heap of them there in the 2013 study, that's yellow. Red is 2011 fieldwork, and blue, there weren't any at that location in 2012, but you can see the location just to the right of it. There's a big blue patch, so that was in 2012. So they were surveyed over 3 years, and you can see they're moving around, but basically they found mostly where the mine is exactly proposed to go. And notice that they're not actually found much outside the mine site. I'll come back to that, because when we look at where the offsets are proposed for this mine, basically they propose offsets in places where there are no black-throated finch now, which is, you might think, is kind of a problem. Now, before I get to the offsets though, I wanted to point out that none of the consultants who conducted the BTF surveys for Adani were called as witnesses in the Land Court trial in 2015, and that appears to me to have been a litigation tactic to avoid them being questioned on choices made by them and Adani about the surveys, because the surveys looked really dodgy when you dug into them. And this table looks a bit daunting, but I'm going to unpack it, because the middle column shows what Adani showed as the BTF records when they were applying to have the mine approved. So, and then on the right are what the experts, when we went to court, what the experts found were additional records that Adani hadn't accounted for. So Adani found that there were 125 recorded observations. The experts in court found an additional 40. Adani found that there was a cumulative total of 1,025 black-throated finch recorded on the mine site. The experts found there were records for another 1,019. Now notice with in the next row, the number of flocks over 30, Adani found 9, the experts found records of an additional 7, but then for flocks over 50 and 100, Adani found none. So no big flocks, yet the experts, when they looked at the records, found, well, there was 5 records of flocks over 50 and at least 3 of over 100, including that picture I just showed you. So what this seems to be is a deliberate underreporting during the EIS process by the applicant and its consultants, and that got exposed through the court process. But neither Adani nor any of the consultants were ever prosecuted for misleading reporting of black-throated finch numbers and habitat values of the site, because why they were underreporting it was because they don't want it to be seen as this vital site for this threatened species to survive, because that makes it, you know, harder to get approval. So they're underreporting the numbers, but never prosecuted. Now, under the current laws, there are offences for providing false and misleading information. Could have been, I thought when the laws came in 2000, that they were some of the most important provisions, because they could really revolutionise environmental impact assessment in Australia, because we suffer from essentially corrupted processes where paid consultants underreport the environmental impacts and governments just accept the bullshit that they're given. So those offences in the EPBC Act, if they had been enforced, they actually could have revolutionised our environmental impact assessment. They've just basically never been used. It just makes me want to cry. But the lack of enforcement, the bigger picture is the lack of enforcement of existing laws is a really big problem, a big problem. So the mine was approved under the Act and state laws based on offsetting black-throated finch habitat losses, but, and it's literally a big but, so what they're saying is, you let us mine this area and we will offset the impacts that will occur to black-throated finch habitat by managing other areas better. But planning for the offsets is difficult because the habitat requirements of black-throated finch are uncertain. We really don't know why they're located on the mine site or what the offsets need to contain. We don't understand whether it's fire regime, whether it's predators, whether it's a particular grass that's there, the availability of water. We don't know why they're on the mine site. So how do you do offsets if you don't know why they're where they are, which you're going to destroy? What are you offsetting? Like, what are you actually improving on the other sites? The other thing with the offsets is they didn't need to prove them before they got the approval. So it's really this basically, trust us and we'll make it work. We don't know how yet, but we will make it work. And they basically gave these broad areas where the offsets will be located. And I just want to compare the two maps. So on the left, you can see where the black-throated finch are located. They're mainly located on the mine site. They're not located on that western boundary, just outside the mine site. They're not really located to the north. But that's where all of the offsets are provided by the applicant. So you've got this real discrepancy between where the impacts are going to be and where the offsets are going to be, and you really don't know how you're going to get those offsets to work. And there's a huge amount of criticism of offsets, and I noticed one of the questions that we'll come to in the Q&A session is about offsets. Offsets are, in my view, are a huge problem in our national and state systems. And Martine Morone from University of Queensland, a former colleague of mine, was a lead author in a great article about the Faustian bargain for restoration realities in the context of biodiversity offset policies back in 2012 in biological conservation. And she said in that, or the author said in that, one of the most common criticisms levelled at biodiversity offsets is that they exchange certain losses for uncertain gains. There's uncertainty at many levels, there's time lags, there's an inability to measure. So there's huge problems with offsets. But essentially that's how decision makers justify approving the Adani mine, because they say, oh, well, we know there'll be impacts on BTF, but we will offset those impacts. So offsets is basically used as this get out of jail free card. So in terms of the key problems, to wrap up the problems, key problems with the Adani approval for BTF was not the lack of referral. So lack of referrals under the EPBC Act is a big problem for land clearing for agriculture. So when you look at the maps in the TWIS report, you'll see these big areas about regulated and unregulated. Well, underreporting is farmers not referring their big clearing extents for assessment under the Act is a big problem, but it's not for the Adani mine. But apart from lack of referrals, the problems that I would suggest for the approval of this mine under the EPBC Act are lack of enforcement of the laws requiring accurate information in the applications. That's a huge problem. The illusory offsets, I just think offsets are often used pretty well as legalised fraud, which is a contradiction in terms, but yeah. And thirdly, the massive problem that we've got with approvals generally under the EPBC Act is the political culture of decision making by the minister. Often delegates make the decision, but any big controversial ones get made by the minister. So in that decision making process, there's a huge discretion for the minister to take into account economic and social benefits. And so money and jobs almost always win over environmental impacts, however great. So that discretion at the end of the day, if you give it to a political decision maker, it's going to be, the environment's going to lose generally. It's very rare. Peter Garrett made some courageous decisions when he was the Environment Minister. So you can have a courageous Environment Minister. Obviously, Peter Garrett got a lot of flack for things he did when Environment Minister. My view, though, was he was very courageous and got the wins that he thought he could get away with within the constraints of the Labor Party. He refused a number of things under the EPBC Act, including a massive dam here in southeast Queensland, the Traviston Crossing Dam. So he made some important decisions that were politically risky, but he's an exception. Basically, most of the ministers that we've had under the Act, the environment is, we know that in federal cabinet, the environment portfolio is generally, you're wearing the dunce's cap. Treasury and Defence and all those other big departments, they are where most of the power is. So, political decision making is a huge problem. So the Adani mine displays many failures that occur more broadly in our national and state environmental laws. And the key point in the TWIS report that our national laws have clearly failed to protect habitats for threatened species. The Adani mine is an example of that. And if we look at the report more broadly, you'll see this map in the middle of the report. which the red shows unregulated loss, and the blue shows potentially regulated loss under the EPBC Act. So we've lost a huge amount of habitat while the EPBC Act has been in force. And koala losses, this is another map from the report showing in purple known habitat loss and likely habitat loss. So we've lost huge amount of habitat since this act has been enforced. It's clearly failing. So what's the solution? Again, I really want to emphasize there's no simple single solution that we can set and forget. I like to think of environmental law and policy like working in a garden. They require ongoing attention and work. You know, you can't go into a garden, throw a couple of seeds on the ground, walk away, expect to come back in 2 years' time and find a tree, you know, bearing fruit. You've got to, you know, weed, you've got to water, you've got to tend your garden constantly to ensure that you get a harvest. The same with our environmental laws or environmental policy generally. That's why there'll always be a need for TWIS and other con groups. And I think one of the most important things we need to do as conservationists and campaigners is to see our careers as a marathon, not a sprint, because you see a lot of people burn out in the conservation sector because I think people come in wanting to fix all the problems or fix a big problem, and they get just caught up in it and they get disappointed that they can't fix the problem in 5 or 10 years or something like that, and then they get burn out and leave. So see your career as a marathon. We've got a huge amount of work to do and it's not going to end. So I like to think of myself as a gardener, not as an engineer building some perfect set of laws that will fix everything. So I hope that that's a useful idea for you. Think of yourself as a gardener. Okay, can I just unpack very briefly who regulates the environment? And you've got this handout which is shown on this slide. So if you take out the handout, I hope that this is useful to just set in your mind. So we've got these 3 levels of government. Everyone knows that. We've got our national laws. We've got our national government, which we call it the federal government, the Commonwealth government, the Australian government, the national government. All of those words are used interchangeably. So if you hear someone talking about federal government or the Commonwealth government or the Australian government, it's all the same thing. We've got 6 state and 2 mainland territory governments. You all know that. Often local government is just set as a block. They say we've got local governments as well. I like this diagram because the number of local governments is at the moment around 540. And you know when you actually work with local governments that they're very different beasts. You know, there are some local governments that are incredibly pro-development and write their laws and their planning schemes so that development can occur anywhere. There are some local governments, like say Byron Bay, for many years has been fighting to try and keep Byron Bay, you know, not killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Noosa Shire Council in Queensland, you know, they're councils that have fought to stop high-rise, to maintain national parks, to maintain, you know, the beautiful surroundings that they have. And then you go to other places like, dare I say, the Gold Coast in Queensland, that, you know, where there's pretty well nothing left of the natural environment that once there. So local governments are very diverse, and there's hundreds of them. So when we think about who regulates what, well, you know that, like at a national level, just from listening to the news, you know that the national government deals with things like international policy, defence, immigration. You know that state governments deal with things like, you know, public, you know, prisons, police, schools. Generally, you think of, you know, like the estates at that sort of being responsible for those sorts of things. And then at a local government, you're familiar with like rubbish collection or dog registration and those sorts of things. Also town planning, if you've been involved with the planning system at all. Now, if we think about the environment, it'd be nice if you could just say, well, one level is responsible for the environment, or they have discrete areas that they're responsible for, but the reality is really different. It's not a neatly layered cake. Can I just emphasize that? Regulation of the environment is not a neatly layered cake that you can divide between the national, state, and local governments in really any meaningful way. It's more like a scrambled egg, you know? It's just all mixed together and cooked. And it's illusory to try and really separate out. The key thing that I would emphasise, though, is that every level of government has powers for environmental protection, but the Commonwealth is ultimately in control where and when it chooses to be. And I'll just emphasise that. And I've made, on the reverse side of your handout, you'll see that there's these key points. And this is, I think, right at the top. Yeah, first dot point is this. Every level of government has powers for environmental protection, but the Commonwealth is ultimately in control where and when it chooses to be. Now, that statement is a broad summary of basically Commonwealth environmental powers, bringing in Australia's international legal obligations, a whole range of legal stuff. But it comes to that endpoint. And the endpoint is really all you need to know. The Commonwealth is in control where and when it chooses to be. So you can think about national environmental laws. You know, we're not going to do away with our states and our territories or our local governments. That's just not going to happen. They're going to be there and they're going to be involved in environmental protection. But you can think about national environmental laws as a vital safety net to protect us, the places we love, and our prosperity. So again, I really like metaphors in terms of campaigning and explaining to people. You know, like if someone, say you're door knocking and you say to someone, we're campaigning, hi, we're from Twiz, we're campaigning for new national environmental laws. And someone said to you, and the reply from the person you door knock to is, okay, well, why do we need them? Well, my answer would be, national environmental laws are a vital safety net that protect us, the places we love, and our prosperity. There you go. So safety net, nice metaphor that people can understand. That would be my answer. So if we look at the current national environmental laws, they're called the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Basically, the title is a load of bullshit. It was meant to, there were a whole heap of environmental protection acts around Australia when this act came in. They just took a whole heap of buzzwords and put them into a title, because when you actually look at the environment, the EPBC Act, as it's called for short, the environment protection sections also deal with biodiversity conservation, and there's no real separation between environment protection and biodiversity conservation in the Act. It's all just buzzwords that are there. So if we look at the current EPBC Act, it was enacted in 1999 by the Howard government. Its main provisions protect 9 what are called matters of national environmental significance, including World Heritage properties, listed threatened species such as the black-throated finch, and water resources from large mines and coal seam gas. And you might have seen just in the last couple of days, the Australian Conservation Foundation has just started a new case against the Adani mine, and the approvals related to what's called the water trigger. So that's that third point. Now, I won't go through all of the matters of national environmental significance. You don't, I think, need to know them in detail. But what I would say about the Act is, be aware that it reflects a political compromise under the Howard government. It does not represent the limits of Commonwealth environment powers by any means. Commonwealth could have gone further. It was a political compromise at the time. And if you're interested in the EPBC Act, on my website there's a 2-hour lecture that I gave 3 years ago now, but it's still current. It hasn't really changed. We no longer have the one-stop shop being proposed, which was a proposal by the Abbott government to devolve this final decision-making to state governments. That's pretty well died. It's technically still on the current federal government's books, but it's really died. So that lecture, if you're interested, it goes through the history of how the Commonwealth came to have environment powers recognised in the Tasmanian Dams dispute, and it talks about the EPBC Act in more detail. It goes for 2 hours. You don't need to listen to it. I'm just saying it's there if you want to listen to it. The key things that I would say to you, really I've tried to give you on the handout. So those are the only things that I think you need to know to be comfortable with going out and talking with people about why Twiz's campaign is important, why we should do it, and building the political momentum for it. Key things are the current laws and regulators are failing badly, and we need to reboot our national laws. That's what I ultimately come to. I think we need to reboot. Dangerous climate change and loss of threatened species reflect systemic failures for which the Commonwealth is ultimately responsible in Australia. And so the report, it's got longer recommendations. So if you turn to the recommendations page, it's a bit longer. But I boil it down to these 3 key points. We need national leadership, we need new national environmental laws, and we need a new independent regulator. And it's the third of those that I'd really emphasise, because we need a new, well-funded, independent regulator, because we need to minimise political enforcement or lack of enforcement and political approvals. And if you look at other sort of examples of independent regulators in the Australian system now, well, a great one would be the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, so the ACCC, but also the Reserve Bank. Grumpa, not such a great example, but it's because it's still quite political, Grumpa. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. The ABC obviously doesn't regulate things, but I like the ABC is a good example, because we know that, just the news in the recent months about how the ABC board works. So technically it's set up under legislation as an independent board, and then it's meant to be at arm's length so that the government of the day and the minister can't control it. But you can see the way that if you're a government and you don't like what an independent body is doing, is you appoint someone that's friendly to you as their head or the chair, and then you cut their funding, which is what the coalition government has, attacked the ABC's funding. So, it's not a regulator, but it's a good example about how an independent body that the government doesn't like, how they kill it. Or if they can't kill it because that's politically, they can't absolutely kill it, how they minimise the threat that it poses. You put someone who you like in charge and you defund it. And that's used, in the US it's used a lot to get rid of environment and other regulators, consumer protection. So the regulator needs to be independent and well funded, because we need to minimise the influence of politics. And also I'd say that large aggressive companies can cower governments into lack of regulation and out-resource ordinary people and conservation groups fighting litigation. And just on the ABC website today, so this isn't in the slides that I provided yesterday, because it's just a story that caught my eye. On ABC, if you go on to it right now, you'd see this story about a Ramsar wetland, which is in Brisbane, Moreton Bay Ramsar wetland, where there's been this controversial proposal called Tudor Harbor. And basically in the story it talks about how the former Environment Minister rejected advice from his own department that the development should be rejected at the start as clearly unacceptable. The proponent had made generous donations to both the government and to the Labor Party, and the corporation threatened the government with basically litigation. And it's a really good example, I think, of many things. I'm not saying that there's direct corruption in this. I'm just saying that these are all of the things that you see commonly in big projects. A lot of money, a political interest in getting it approved, and also the threat of litigation. I'm not going to emphasise this. Again, this wasn't in the slides. I'm writing an article about the stark difference between theory and practice in environmental law. But the thing that I've come to realise is in environmental law is that environmental law is hard and money talks. Money talks in Australia not in terms of direct corruption, but in the culture of regulatory capture and decision making implementing environmental laws in which jobs and money routinely are given preeminence over environmental damage. And money talks in the reality that large aggressive companies can cower governments into lack of regulation, out-resource ordinary people. At the moment I'm involved in have been involved in a series of massive cases about a big coal mine in Queensland, where what you see on your screen is an illegal pit that's 2 kilometres across by 1 kilometre north to south. It's got about $1 billion worth of coal in it, not approved under federal law or state laws. The large aggressive company is willing to spend unlimited money to continue mining, and there's no action by regulators against it. And it's just, again, breaks my heart that our laws are just not enforced. So there's no quick fix to all of this. And there's going to be a need for ongoing work, even if new national laws and an independent regulator are created. But new laws and a new regulator are a critical step. And I just want to finish before going to the Q&A with this point from Al Gore. Because our new national leadership and new national laws ultimately depend upon political will. And you can feel pretty despondent about political will at the moment in Australia when you look at our terrible federal government and you look at the US and you see even where it makes our federal government look like a well-run greeny lefty organisation. So you can get despondent about the political situation, but I often think of what Al Gore said, that political will is a renewable resource. your job and the job of the campaign is to renew the political imperative of protecting the environment, build a momentum for new laws and new leadership in this area, because it's vitally important. So, we dealt with the problem, dealt with the solution. Let's turn over to questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. I think how we'll do this is quickly jump around to each state centre, so every state centre gets to ask a quick question.
The clause, Chris, that you said could have been a real game changer but hasn't been enforced at all. Who is that making the decision not to enforce that?
So it's section 489 to 491 of the EPBC Act, and it basically makes it a criminal offence to submit false or misleading information to gain an approval or under a condition of an approval under the Act. So an applicant, in applying or making a referral, if they provide information that says, they know that there's a lot of threatened species on the site, and they change the numbers like Adani seem to have done and ignore a lot of evidence that they're aware of, then that is false and misleading, and they could be prosecuted for that. Ultimately, the decision for a prosecution, if it's the department makes a recommendation to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. At a Commonwealth level, criminal prosecutions, the big ones, are handled by the Commonwealth DPP. So, but it needs the department. The DPP doesn't go out and make, like the federal police don't investigate it, it's the department that does the investigation. So the Commonwealth Environment Department have a regulatory staff. They go out and investigate, and they can make a recommendation to the Minister that this should be referred to the DPP for a possible prosecution. If the DPP agree, the Minister refers it, and then the DPP considers it, and if they agree that it's a good case, that there's a public interest in taking the prosecution, then the DPP commences it effectively, so it's the Commonwealth prosecuting. So, but the Minister and the Department are critical, basically, steps. And basically under the EPBC Act, no one gets prosecuted for criminal offences. They just don't do that. They do. There's been some civil litigation, but really the only people that get prosecuted for criminal offences are Indonesian fishermen that kill dolphins and use them for shark bait, and they've been prosecuted. There's been a lot of prosecutions of them for, there's offences for killing cetaceans under the EPBC Act, and whales, dolphins and porpoises. So if you are a fisherman and you kill a dolphin and use it for shark bait, and you get arrested in Australian waters, like let's just say it's an Indonesian fisherman. So you can see the politics though in Australia enforcing the law against illegal Indonesian fishermen killing dolphins. Can you think of a less politically risky environment prosecution in Australia than that? It ticks all of the boxes for both racial prejudice as well as illegal fishing, as well as, hey, we love dolphins. So, but they're the only ones really that get criminal prosecutions under the Act.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up. Nothing we can do, I guess, as organisations or as community members to encourage those prosecutions, or sort of...
You can certainly make complaints. So if you go onto the EPBC Act website, there is a reporting page where you can make complaints to the Commonwealth. And so I've been involved a number of times. Normally, if you're a conservation group and you think there's an offence, the first thing you do is complain to the regulator and try and get them to take action, because they're the ones that have the resources and investigative powers. You don't want to spend any money if you don't have to. So TWIS has done that, made complaints to the Commonwealth. Other groups use it as well. That's the first step. You'd make a complaint and then see if they take action. And if they take action, great. If they don't, then you consider, whether as a group you want to take action. But then it becomes a question of resources.
Let's cross to Launceston.
Yeah, we have a question. Chris, thanks very much for that explanation. It seems to me that the history tells us that our laws really don't mean much. If you've got money, you can do whatever you like. And if there's no political will and there's a job in the project, then the political will will go with the project.
Yep.
How do you suggest we change the political will?
Well, the campaign that Twiz is running, I think, is an important one, and it's all about building political momentum. I've given, there's a talk on my website that I gave recently about fight with the tools we've got. We've got blunt tools. I agree with you that our laws are difficult to enforce, but I really believe you fight with whatever you've got, and this is what we've got at the moment. So Twiz is campaigning to improve it. So to sharpen the tools we've got. But yeah, if I just think of this, use whatever skills you've got, whatever skill set you've got to fight. Does that answer your question?
So, well, yeah, I guess what you're saying is make people more aware of the circumstances and keep on talking to our politicians and try and get them to reprioritise the things that are important to the community. But it's really tough when big corporation comes along with a big wallet and says, we've got something that'll offer you a job.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's just use Launceston as an example. Think about the pulp mill that was proposed. Yes, it did get all of its approvals, but it got killed effectively by the campaign against it. So you guys did a great job there. And big corporation, you fought it and you won.
We're getting old, Chris, we're getting old. We need some younger ones down here.
I can see some young ones there. I can see some young ones.
We'll have to move on. Thank you for your question. Sorry, because we've got a lot of questions that came up. Great question. We may get another time to go back around. So we'll move up to Victoria, and if you could just go back on mute, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Our question was more related to what the proposed laws and National Environmental Protection Act would be able to do. Chris, would they be able to act on the duty of care required on a government to provide healthy living ecosystem services to Australians? For example, Melbourne's drinking water, which is being smashed by logging in our forests, stealing millions of litres of water a day from our precious waterways.
They could. So the Commonwealth would have constitutional power, I would say, to deal with those issues. Actually fleshing out what the laws are. The campaign is really the broad agenda setting, and then the details of it, if you get, let's just say Labor was to commit to new national environmental laws, and they get elected at the next election. So obviously now is a critical time to be campaigning because we've got a federal election coming up. The current federal government, we can't get rid of them quick enough. Everyone's got their baseball bats out ready to whack them come next year if they survive to that point. So it's highly likely that Labor will get elected. And so if we can get Labor to commit to new environment laws, they would then go through a process of creating them, and Twiz and others would campaign for what they want and the details of them. So it's about pushing for that, and then the actual details of what they cover and how they regulate it, that will come down the track. Does that answer your question? I haven't fully answered it. I'd just say that we can deal with that under national environment laws, but that detail, can come.
Cool. Thumbs up. Great question. Thank you.
This is Elle in Newcastle. Do you want to answer, Newey?
Sure, Elle.
Okay. We had one question.
I was wondering how you're saying with the corporations who threaten legal action against departments who don't approve their projects. On what grounds? How can they do that?
Well, you can go and have a read of that ABC website, that news story. It's really good because they've actually got all of the documents where essentially the company went out and got two top international lawyers to give advice to say that the department's decision or recommendation was wrong legally, and they've basically threatened the minister that if you don't basically do what we want, we're going to sue you. So, which might sound like, well, their government, can't they just take any litigation? But these are massive corporations. You're talking about a lot of money. They could run that risk, but it's certainly pause for thought. They're not going to, the litigation isn't going to bankrupt the Commonwealth, But any department ultimately has a litigation budget, and when you look at big litigation, you quickly start to look at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and then you think, well, out of our budget, do we think that this case should get priority, or is there a way that we can avoid this case? So litigation is a tool that's used. If you're a company with unlimited resources, then you litigate. Yeah, if you're aggressive and nasty, you litigate.
What was the name of that news article from the ABC?
Yeah, it's on ABC website right now. The Toondah, we can send around the link.
Yeah,
but
I can share around.
Yeah, share around the link. It's got all the, it's like exactly, it's a Commonwealth EPBC Act, it's a Ramsar wetland, it's got all of the documents that have been obtained through FI. It's just a really good example of, because I come back to that my conclusion after 20 years is that all of our principles about ESD and the like, they mean ultimately environmental law and policy, it's just really hard to implement. It's always a fight, and money is very powerful in it. It's very powerful because of the resources that can be brought to fight, including fighting governments. I'm not saying I'm going to go and jump off a bridge. I'm saying, because I come back to fight with the tools we've got, this is the system, this is the hand we're dealt. We need to fight hard, and the campaigning that TWIS does is invaluable. So don't lose heart. Use what we've got. Fight, and also, as I said before, see what you're doing as a marathon, not as a sprint, because it's so easy to get burnt out in this sector.
Great question. Thank you, Newcastle. Go to Sydney.
Thanks, Gemma. It's Garth here in Sydney. My question is really around the independent organisations that are proposed in our new law's proposal, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Sustainability Commission, and the community participation process that creates more transparency and decision making. And I was really kind of depressed about the fact that in the light of the federal government's total rejection of the independent institutions proposed in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that really our purpose is finding a way to set an agenda that that all of the population will see these independent institutions as vital. And my question really is, how do we frame that story to make those institutions indispensable?
Well, I'd probably flip that around to, if you think about, say, the ABC, which I talked about before, why do we see that as valuable? Like, why, when the government goes to cut ABC funding, why do people get out and protest? Because there is such broad community support for it. Environment protection, we always need to be building the value that people see in the protection of the natural environment and prosperity around them, because without that political support, we won't advance. So I don't have a simple answer to your question, but I do see the links to things like the ABC or other regulators that are treated as politically, they're given a lot of independence, and the ACCC is a good example because it's about consumer protection. It also has a lot of political support. So even though governments are often uncomfortable with its prosecutions that it makes, that's really the model that we need, that there is an independent organisation that people see value in, that politicians can't take away the powers of and get away with. So we're not going to get it tomorrow. It's obviously it's an important goal, but that's what this campaign is about. This campaign is not about things that are going to be achieved tomorrow or even by March next year. And Labor, if Labor gets elected and they commit to doing these things, there's then going to be years of actually creating it, bedding it down, building ongoing support for these organisations, so that the next time the coalition get in, they can't just get in and wreck it.
Brisbane. Anyone here in the Brisbane office have a question they'd like to ask?
What was the initial impetus for the Howard government to bring in the Act?
Oh, so why did Howard do it? So this is really the culmination of really post the Tasmanian Dam case in 1983. It was really unsettled where the Commonwealth would draw the boundaries. So there was a whole series of proposals for what the Commonwealth would be responsible for. And when Howard, so the Hawke government had a set of similar to matters of national environmental significance, and Howard took that forward. And the Environment Minister at the time essentially convinced them, and ultimately the EPBC Act was strengthened a lot by the Democrats. When Meg Lees did the negotiations for the EPBC Act, it actually got strengthened considerably. You might say, well, it's a bad law, but there are a lot of extra strength was built into it. The Democrats traded things that because they came to support Howard's GST package, and Howard would have sold his family and house and everything to get his GST package through. So it was ultimately a political compromise, but it was it's really the where the dust settled after the Tasmanian Dam case in 1983. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah, and there's a lot that led up to it. Sorry, can I just add to that? So one of the things that the Act doesn't deal with really is regional forest agreements, which are a big problem for forestry in Victoria and in Tasmania. So those are dealt with under the Regional Forest Agreements Act, and essentially that's hived out. So there are other Commonwealth environment laws. This is a complicated compromise, but it's really the centerpiece of Commonwealth environment laws. Yeah,
We are campaigning.
Yeah. You'd campaign. If you redid the EPBC Act, you'd also redo the RFA stuff.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. We will hand over to Suzanne Millthorpe, who's in Sydney, who's our National Nature Campaigner, just to wrap up and say thanks. So I'll hand over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Gemma, and thank you so much, Chris. That was a really great deep dive into the problems of these laws. As James said earlier, it can be a little bit grim, but I thought you really also sold the case for what we can do and the fact that we really actually could have some very effective action on this, and that's what this campaign is all about. And so absolutely thank you, Chris. I think a big round of applause. But I'd also like to thank all of you for coming in from around the country and spending your time to come and listen to this. And of course, all of the organisers for organising this as well. I mean, I've only been with Wilderness Society for 4 years, but my understanding is this is actually the first big multi-campaign centre webinar or information night that we've done like that, where people have come together from all the country. Follows on from the really great Action for Threatened Species Day earlier in the year, where every single campaign centre around the country came together to bring people in Canberra and turn people out. I think that really actually says a lot about the universality of this campaign and the need for it and the importance of it. And there was really, I think that Adani example that you gave is actually such a great example of why we need these laws. Not only because we've got this terrible mega mine where you're just basically demonstrating all of the problems with the laws, but the fact that it's the scale of this destruction happening over hundreds of projects, happening over tens of millions of hectares around the country, that analogy of the whack-a-mole that we're just trying to fight against, and we're trying to stop basically hundreds of Adanis everywhere. And that's why we need, I think the great word that you used there, Chris, was systemic. We need to change the system, because at the moment we're playing whack-a-mole, and we've got to change the game, because there's no way that you can win a game of whack-a-mole. So it's also a really great reminder, I think, why we need independent watchdogs, independent bodies. You cannot leave this up to politicians. The system is too corrupt. Actually, interestingly enough, in America, which we often think is having really terrible protections, they've got this thing called the Endangered Species Act, which Trump is merrily trying to kill because it's not letting him do anything he wants to do. But it actually prohibits decision makers taking economic considerations into account when making decisions about the environment. And it also legislates that you actually have to protect critical habitat. And so one of the reasons she's trying to kill it is because it's so gosh darn effective. It's always a really good sign to get from the other side. And I think the other thing that really jumped out to me there, I was taking a couple of quick notes, was the fact that it's those questions, we see these questions coming from you all around the country, and the fact that you've all turned out is because you've all got these local fights, and a local fight but also a concern for what's happening around the country.
And it really emphasises one of the other reasons why we need these laws and why we've got to actually make the Australian government stand up and do it, is because it's the only jurisdiction that can solve all these problems, can solve our extinction crisis, that can take charge, that can deal with all of the fight happening around the country, but they can also do what we need it to do, which is start actually rebuilding some of the stuff that's been trashed. So it was a really great talk, and a really, I think, really great for all of us to be able to hear a little bit more about the laws and the reasons why we need such a big campaign. So from the strategy from here, I mean, all of you guys are here is because you've seen that we're part of this fight. In fact, we've been part of this fight since 2013, working with people like Chris and the Australian Panel of Expert Environmental Lawyers, building the Places You Love Alliance, and really working strongly with them. And we're really now at crunch time, like this really big, I think what you call as a fulcrum point, a point of massive opportunity. We've got a federal campaign coming up. Obviously, we want a federal government to take action. There is a strong chance that there could be a change of government, and one of the major parties that is contender for government has pretty much close to adopted our policy. They need more work to push them across the line. They need more work to tighten them up. And very, very importantly, once they get into power, if they get into power day one, they need us to be there going, great, so you said you were going to do this thing, when are you going to start, mate? It's a vital part of any election campaign. But I think the thing we need to underline is this is a massive, massive opportunity, which is why I'm super excited to see people all around the country attending this campaign night, really getting into grips with this campaign. The strategy from here to the election, deceptively simple. It's going to take a lot of us, it's going to take a lot of work, but it's deceptively simple, and that's build awareness, like we're doing tonight, build awareness in and build momentum in our communities, going out, talking to people. And I guarantee I talk to people all around the country every day. Everyone, as I'm sure every one of you, has a story, has a reason why they need these laws and why they want to stop playing this continent-wide game of whack-a-mole. So we're going to do that. That's going to be a massive part, big, fun election campaign. Those are always actually really exciting to be part of, so really definitely would encourage you to join the campaign for that. And we're also just going to build a wall of noise around this issue. We want everyone from every side of politics, from right to left, and particularly also those people in between, sometimes those vital independents like the Democrats, really want them, everyone to hear this wall of noise from Australians like you and me, and the people in your communities, the people that you're talking to, say, this is what nature lovers want. We want to end our extinction crisis. We want to end our deforestation crisis, because it's ridiculous that we're the only developed country in the world that has one. We want action on climate change. We want action to prepare our country for climate change, and we want to repair the damage of 200 years of really crappy decisions. So, as I said, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. There is some really exciting stuff coming up. Speak to your organisers in your centre, speak to your friends about this. Definitely, please join the campaign, join your local teams, and your organiser will also have, we've got a petition that we're trying to get out to as many people as possible. It's essentially an open letter to our governments, and it does two things. One is it allows us to build those conversations in those communities and say, I need you to sign this and this is why. But also, it also allows us at some point to go and deliver 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 signatures to a bunch of dudes in Canberra who are trying to call back from some commitments, or maybe trying to call back from some commitments. We go, here's 500,000 reasons why, and all of these dudes will be contacting you if you don't do what you said you were going to do. So, I think I'll look at next. We're now 15 minutes over, and I'm aware that I could talk about this all night underwater. So thank you so much, and thank you so much to Chris. I think another great big round of applause.